1 year had passed since that night. The judge stood at his courthouse window, watching the morning sun paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. On his desk sat a pile of letters, updates from police departments across the country that had adopted his Bridge the Gap program. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "The ceremony starts in an hour," his clerk reminded him gently. Today was special. The first class of officers trained under the new program was graduating. But this wasn't just about new badges, it was about a new way of thinking. The community center auditorium was packed. Families filled the seats, children clutched handmade signs, and cameras flashed. In the front row sat the 2 officers from that night, not fired, but transformed. The judge had insisted on a different approach to their discipline. Firing them would have been easier, he told the police chief back then. But would it have changed anything? They need to be part of the solution. Those officers had spent the year doing more than just attending sensitivity training. They'd worked in community centers, volunteered with youth programs, and shared their story with every new recruit. Their honest accounts of confronting their own biases had become a powerful teaching tool. The police chief approached the podium. "A year ago, we faced a choice," he began. "We could have treated this as a PR crisis to manage. Instead, we chose to see it as a wake-up call." The statistics told the story. Civilian complaints down by 60%. Use of force incidents reduced by half. But the numbers didn't capture the real changes. The coffee shops where officers and residents now chatted like neighbors, the youth basketball games where kids high-fived police coaches, the community meetings where real conversations happened. A young graduate stepped up to speak. "Before joining the force, I thought being tough was what made a good officer," she said. "Now I know that understanding makes us stronger. Compassion makes us safer." In the audience, the judge spotted familiar faces. The grandmother who'd spoken at that first training session now led a community advisory board. The skeptical activist had become a regular instructor in the program. Former defendants sat proudly watching their family members graduate as new officers. The ceremony paused for a video presentation, clips from the past year showing the changes in action. Officers attending neighborhood cookouts, community members joining police training sessions, kids teaching officers their favorite games at the park. Each image showed what was possible when walls came down and bridges went up. "But our work isn't finished," the judge said when it was his turn to speak. "This is just the beginning. Real change happens one interaction at a time, one day at a time, one person at a time." He shared a story from the previous week, a traffic stop that could have gone wrong. The officer had recognized signs of stress in the driver, taken time to listen, and discovered a father rushing to pick up his sick child. Instead of a ticket, the officer provided an escort to the hospital. "That officer was one of our program graduates," the judge said. "He showed us what justice looks like when we lead with understanding." After the ceremony, people lingered, sharing stories and taking photos. A small boy tugged at the judge's robe. "My big sister graduated today," he announced proudly. "She says she wants to be just like you. Fair." The afternoon sun streamed through the windows as the judge walked through the crowd. He overheard snippets of conversation, officers and civilians making plans for community projects, discussing ideas for program improvements, sharing hopes for the future. Back in his chambers that evening, the judge added today's program to his growing collection of memories. Next to it sat the original viral video that started it all, a reminder of how far they'd come. His phone buzzed with a message. Another city wanted to implement the program. Another chance to turn a moment of injustice into a movement for change. As he gathered his things to leave, he passed the holding cell where he'd spent that night a year ago. It looked different now, not just a place of confinement, but a reminder that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes. Outside, the sun was setting on another day of progress. Small steps, big changes, and the hope that somewhere, someone else would learn from their story and continue building bridges where walls once stood. 6 months after that fateful night, the old community center buzzed with energy. People filled every seat in the large meeting room. Police officers, community members, legal professionals, and social workers all gathered together. At the front of the room, the judge stood beside a veteran police officer, both ready to lead today's training session. "Welcome to the first day of our new Bridge the Gap program," the judge began, his voice carrying to the back of the room. "We're here because we all want the same thing, a justice system that works for everyone. The program was his brainchild, born from his own experience. Instead of letting anger guide him, he channeled everything into creating real change. The training wasn't just about rules and regulations, it was about understanding each other's perspectives. A young officer raised his hand. "I'll be honest, sir. We're trained to be suspicious, to expect the worst. How do we balance safety with fairness?" The judge nodded, appreciating the honest question. "Let me tell you about my first day back on the bench after my arrest," he replied. "I was nervous, defensive, but then I remembered how it felt to be judged unfairly, and it changed how I saw every person who came before me." The room grew quiet as he shared his story. Even the skeptics in the back row leaned forward to listen. This wasn't just another mandatory training, this was real talk about real experiences. They broke into small groups, mixing officers with community members. The conversations weren't always easy, but they were necessary. People shared stories of times they felt misunderstood, afraid, or angry. Officers talked about their fears and pressures. Community members spoke about their experiences with law enforcement. "Yesterday, I would have seen a threat," one officer admitted during a role-playing exercise. "Today, I'm learning to see a person first." The judge moved between groups, listening and guiding discussions. He watched as people who might never have spoken to each other found common ground. A teenager explained to officers how it felt to be followed in stores. A police sergeant shared what it was like to make split-second decisions while trying to remember endless protocols. During the lunch break, people didn't separate into their usual groups. Officers sat with community members, sharing sandwiches and stories. The walls between us and them were slowly coming down. The afternoon session focused on practical changes. They reviewed real cases, discussing how different approaches could have led to better outcomes. The judge shared body camera footage from his own arrest, turning a painful experience into a powerful teaching tool. "Look at this moment," he said, freezing the video. "What do you see? What assumptions were made? What could have been done differently?" A community activist who'd been skeptical at first spoke up. "I came here thinking this would be just another talk shop. But this is different. We're not just talking about change, we're creating it." The police chief stood up to address the room. "Starting next month, this training becomes mandatory for every officer in our department. But more than that, we're changing how we measure success. It's not just about number of arrests anymore, it's about positive community interactions." As the session wound down, people exchanged phone numbers and made plans to stay in touch. A grandmother hugged the officer who'd been in her discussion group. A rookie cop asked a community leader to speak at his precinct's next meeting. The judge watched it all from the back of the room. His secretary appeared at his elbow with more good news. Other cities were calling, wanting to learn about the program. What had started as a response to one incident was growing into something bigger. "You know what's different about this?" a senior officer said as they packed up. "Usually, we talk about community relations like it's us versus them. But here, it's just us, all of us, figuring it out together." Outside, the sun was setting on another day of change. People lingered in the parking lot, continuing conversations they couldn't quite let go of yet. The judge overheard snippets. Officers making plans to attend community events, residents organizing ride-alongs, everyone talking about what they'd learned. As he gathered his materials, the judge found a note left on his podium. "Thank you," it read, "for turning your pain into our progress." He smiled, tucked the note into his pocket, and headed out into the evening, knowing that tomorrow would bring another day of small steps toward big changes. Nobody expected what happened next. It started with a letter from the state prison, carefully handwritten on lined paper. The judge read it during his morning coffee, his eyes widening with each paragraph. The writer was someone he'd sentenced 5 years ago, a young man who'd made some bad choices but showed real remorse during his trial. "You showed me respect when I stood in your courtroom," the letter read. "Even when you gave me time, you looked me in the eye and told me you believed I could do better. Now I'm watching the news, seeing what happened to you, and I need to speak up." That first letter opened the floodgates. More started arriving, from county jail, from probation officers' offices, from people who'd stood before him over the years. Each one told a story, not just about their cases, but about how the judge had treated them with dignity, even when handing down sentences. The judge's secretary brought in another stack one morning. These are different, she said, sorting through them. They want to help. They want to testify about their experiences in your courtroom. A local news reporter caught wind of the story. Former defendants rally behind judge, the headline read. The article featured interviews with people the judge had sentenced, each describing moments of fairness and humanity in his courtroom. One man, now running a successful small business after serving his time, spoke about how the judge had recommended a job training program instead of maximum sentence. He saw me as a person who made a mistake, he said, not just as a criminal. The judge's phone rang. It was the public defender's office. You won't believe this, the defender said. We've got current inmates asking to submit statements about their experiences in your court. They're willing to testify about the difference between being treated with respect versus what happened during your arrest. A community meeting was organized at the local library. The room was packed. Former defendants sat next to lawyers, probation officers next to social workers. People who'd once been on opposite sides of the law were now united by a common cause. One speaker, a grandmother who'd faced the judge over a minor offense years ago, stood up shakily. When I saw that video, she said, her voice strong despite her age, I thought about how he treated me in court. He listened to my whole story, asked about my grandkids, gave me a chance to make things right. That's the kind of justice we all deserve. The stories kept coming. A young man who'd completed drug court spoke about how the judge had attended his graduation ceremony. A woman told how the judge had considered her family situation before sentencing, ensuring her children would be cared for. Even more surprising were the letters from current inmates. We might be serving time, one wrote, but we know right from wrong. What happened to you was wrong, and we want to stand up and say so. The judge sat in his chambers, surrounded by these testimonials. Each one represented a person he tried to see as more than their worst moment. Now they were doing the same for him. His clerk knocked on the door. Sir, there's a group outside. Former defendants who want to organize a peaceful support rally. They're asking for your blessing. Walking to his window, the judge could see them gathering, people he'd sentenced now holding signs supporting justice reform. Some had brought their families. Others wore their work uniforms, having come straight from the jobs they'd found after turning their lives around. A reporter asked one of the organizers why they were supporting someone who'd sent them to jail. Because he did it right, the man replied. He treated us like humans. Now it's our turn to stand up for him. The judge's phone buzzed with a message from his colleague on the bench. Have you seen this? It was a link to a social media post gone viral. A split screen of the judge's arrest video next to footage from his courtroom, showing his respectful treatment of defendants over the years. As the sun set on another day of this extraordinary situation, the judge looked at a photo on his desk. It showed him with graduates from the drug court program, all smiling proudly. He remembered what he always told them, your past actions don't define your future choices. Now these people, who society had often written off, were choosing to stand up, speak out, and support the very system that had punished them because they'd experienced firsthand how justice should work. It was proof that treating people with dignity, even in difficult moments, could create unexpected allies in the fight for a better system. The police department's conference room felt tense that morning. Files and papers were spread across the long table, and department officials sat stiffly in their chairs, reviewing body camera footage for the 100th time. The internal affairs investigator, a veteran with 20 years of experience, stood at the front of the room, pointing at freeze frames from that night. Let's go through this again, she said, her voice firm but tired. They'd been at it for hours. The officers claimed they had reasonable suspicion, but the dash cam shows no traffic violation. The judge's taillight wasn't out. His registration was current. He wasn't speeding. A younger investigator raised his hand. I've been going through Officer R's previous stops. There's a pattern here. He spread out a stack of reports. In the last 6 months, 85% of his discretionary stops involved minority drivers. That's way above the department average. The room grew quieter. Someone coughed uncomfortably. The police chief rubbed his forehead, looking older than he had just a week ago. There's more, another investigator added, sliding forward a thick folder. We found 3 previous complaints against this officer, all buried in the system, all involving similar situations, all dismissed without proper investigation. Outside, protesters still gathered daily, their signs visible through the conference room windows. Local news vans had become a permanent fixture in the parking lot. The department's public information officer hadn't slept properly in days, trying to handle the constant media requests. The judge's colleagues are demanding answers, the police chief said, breaking the heavy silence. I just got off the phone with the state Supreme Court. They're watching this investigation closely. A knock on the door interrupted them. An officer entered with fresh printouts, more social media posts, more witnesses coming forward. A store owner across from where the arrest happened had found additional security camera footage showing the entire incident from a different angle. This isn't just about one traffic stop anymore, the Internal Affairs Director said, standing up to stretch her legs. We're looking at years of systemic issues. The data doesn't lie. The department's training coordinator spoke up from the corner. I've been reviewing our training materials. Some of these protocols haven't been updated in 15 years. Our implicit bias training is outdated. Our de-escalation procedures need complete revision. They broke for lunch, but nobody left the room. Officers brought in sandwiches that went mostly uneaten. The weight of what they were uncovering sat heavy in everyone's stomachs. The afternoon brought more revelations. An anonymous officer had come forward with text messages showing concerning conversations between some officers. The department's social media team reported that public trust was at an all-time low. Look at this, the younger investigator said, pulling up a spreadsheet. I cross-reference complaint records with outcomes. There's a clear pattern of dismissing certain types of complaints without proper investigation. We've been failing our community. The police chief stood up, walking to the window. Below, he could see protesters sharing water bottles with the officers on duty. Despite the tension, the community was showing how to handle this crisis with grace. We have two choices, he said, turning back to face the room. We can try to defend these actions, make excuses, and lose what little trust we have left. Or we can take this moment to make real changes. The Internal Affairs Director nodded. The evidence is clear. Both officers violated multiple protocols, but firing them isn't enough. We need systemic change. As evening approached, they drafted their preliminary findings. The report was direct, acknowledging both individual misconduct and institutional failures. They'd recommended immediate suspension of the officers involved, a complete overhaul of training procedures, and an independent review of all similar complaints from the past 5 years. The judge's arrest was just the tip of the iceberg, the training coordinator said, reading over the draft. But maybe that's what we needed, someone the system couldn't ignore, to help us see what so many have been trying to tell us. Before they ended the session, the chief made one final announcement. The judge has agreed to help us reform our training program. He's willing to turn this incident into a teaching moment. As they packed up their files, the setting sun cast long shadows across the conference room. The investigation had revealed uncomfortable truths, but it had also shown a path forward. Sometimes, the hardest lessons were the most important ones to learn. As night fell, the crowds remained, the candles creating a gentle glow in the darkness. The video kept spreading, but it wasn't just about watching anymore. It was about witnessing, understanding, and demanding change. The viral moment had become something much more powerful, a catalyst for conversation, understanding, and hopefully real change. It started with a single social media post. One of the neighbors who'd witnessed the judge's arrest had quietly uploaded the security camera footage from their doorbell camera. The 2-minute video showed everything: the unnecessary aggression, the clear profiling, the judge's dignity in the face of injustice. By breakfast time, the clip had already been shared thousands of times. By lunch, it was millions. News channels started picking it up, first local stations, then national networks. The courthouse's phone lines were ringing nonstop. Have you seen it? A clerk whispered to another as the judge walked past them to his chambers the next morning. He pretended not to hear, but he could feel the eyes following him. The footage played on a loop on the small TV in the courthouse break room, and someone quickly changed the channel when he entered. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from fellow judges, lawyers, and reporters. But it was the comments under the viral video that truly caught his attention. People from all walks of life were sharing similar stories: professionals, students, parents, all describing moments when they'd been judged by their appearance rather than their character. "I can't believe this happened to a judge," one comment read. "If they treat a judge like this, imagine how they treat regular folks." The courthouse steps had become a gathering place. People stood quietly holding signs, some saying "Justice for the judge," and others simply reading "Enough is enough." What struck him most was the diversity of the crowd, people from every background standing together, united by a shared sense of injustice. A young reporter caught up with him as he left for lunch. "Sir, what do you have to say about the video?" She held out her microphone expectantly. The judge paused, choosing his words carefully. "What happened to me happens to people every day. The only difference is most of them don't have a video to prove it." His response went viral too. People shared it alongside the original footage, creating a powerful message about justice and equality. Social media exploded with hashtags and personal stories. The conversation was growing bigger than just one incident, it was becoming a movement. Inside his office, the judge watched the situation unfold on his computer screen. His secretary had sorted through hundreds of interview requests, messages of support, and sadly, some hate mail too. But what caught his eye was an email from a police academy trainer asking if he would consider speaking to new recruits about his experience. The courthouse security guard knocked on his door. "Sir, there's more media outside. And, well, you might want to see this." He handed over his phone, showing a live stream of peaceful gatherings happening in front of courthouses across the country. People were sharing their own stories, demanding change, but doing it with the same dignity the judge had shown during his arrest. "Your Honor," his clerk entered with another stack of messages. "The police chief is requesting a meeting, and the mayor's office has called 3 times." The judge stood at his window, looking down at the growing crowd below. He could see families with children, elderly couples, students, and professionals all standing together. Someone had brought coffee and was sharing it with both protesters and police officers who were monitoring the gathering. A group of his fellow judges had released a joint statement supporting him, but he knew this was about more than just support for one person. The incident had struck a chord because it highlighted a truth many knew but few could prove, that no amount of education, achievement, or status could fully shield you from prejudice. His phone buzzed again, another news alert. The police department had announced an emergency review of their training procedures. The mayor was calling for an independent investigation. Civil rights leaders were organizing town halls to discuss community police relations. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps, the judge noticed something remarkable. The crowd had grown, but they weren't just protesting, they were talking to each other. Police officers were engaging in conversations with community members. Young people were listening to elders share their experiences. Real dialogue was happening. A custodian paused while emptying his office trash. "Never seen anything like this," he said, nodding toward the window. "People are finally paying attention." The judge nodded. "Sometimes it takes a moment to start a movement," he replied quietly. "The question is, what do we do with that moment?" The holding cell at the courthouse felt different from this side of the bars. The judge had walked past it hundreds of times over the years, his robes swishing as he made his way to his courtroom. Now, still in his fundraiser suit, he sat on the cold metal bench, taking in his new perspective. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the faces of his fellow detainees. Some were dozing, others pacing, but a few were staring at him with dawning recognition in their eyes. He could feel the moment each one placed him, their expressions shifting from confusion to disbelief. "Ain't you?" A young man in the corner left the question hanging. The judge recognized him instantly. He'd sentenced him to community service just 3 months ago for a minor offense. The young man had shown genuine remorse during the trial. "Yes," the judge replied simply, maintaining his usual calm demeanor despite the surreal situation. "Good evening." A low murmur spread through the cell as others began to connect the dots. The judge could hear snippets of whispered conversations. "That's him." "The judge. What's he doing in here?" An older man sitting across from him cleared his throat. The judge remembered him too. A case from last year involving a dispute with a neighbor. The man had been frustrated with the ruling at the time, but now he just looked concerned. "They got you too, Pa?" The older man said, shaking his head slowly. "Never thought I'd see the day." The judge straightened his shoulders, his hands folded in his lap. "Life has a way of giving us unexpected perspectives," he replied, his voice steady despite the circumstances. More detainees were paying attention now, drawn into this unusual situation. A teenager in the corner, probably no older than 19, spoke up. "But you're a judge. Can't you just, tell them who you are and get out?" The question hung in the air, heavy with irony. The judge thought carefully before responding. "I did tell them. Sometimes that's not enough." The cell fell quiet as the weight of his words sank in. These men had all stood before him in court, and now here they were, sharing the same space, experiencing the same system from the ground up. One of the overnight officers walked past, doing his routine check. He did a double take when he saw the judge, nearly dropping his clipboard. "Sir, what are you? This must be a mistake." "Indeed it is," the judge agreed calmly. "But mistakes can be educational." The officer hurried off, presumably to make some calls. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the cell had shifted. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by something else, a kind of collective understanding. "I remember when you sentenced me," another man spoke up from the back. "You looked me in the eye. Told me everyone deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes. Guess that goes for the whole system, huh?" The judge nodded thoughtfully. Here he was, sitting with the very people whose lives he'd impacted through his rulings, having conversations he never thought possible. Despite the circumstances, he couldn't help but see the profound opportunity in this moment. Time passed slowly in the cell. The night shift changed guards, paperwork shuffled somewhere in the distance, and the harsh fluorescent lights continued their endless buzzing. But something remarkable was happening in that small space. Stories began to flow, not just about arrests and court dates, but about lives, families, dreams, and struggles. The judge listened, really listened, in a way that the formality of his courtroom rarely allowed. These weren't just case numbers anymore. They were people sharing their experiences with the very system he represented. As dawn approached, casting long shadows through the high windows, the judge realized that this night would change more than just his perspective. It would change how he viewed every person who would stand before him in court from now on. The sound of footsteps approaching drew everyone's attention. The morning shift supervisor appeared, keys jangling. "Judge, sir, we've sorted out the situation. You're free to go." As he stood to leave, the older man who'd spoken earlier caught his eye. "You're gonna remember this, when you're back up there in your robes." The judge paused at the cell door, looking back at the faces that had shared this extraordinary night with him. Every single day, he promised, and he meant it. The clock had just struck 9:30 p.m. when it happened. The distinguished judge was driving home after a successful community fundraiser for local youth programs. The evening had gone well. They'd raised enough money to keep the after-school programs running for another year. His thoughts were still on the bright-eyed kids who'd performed at the event when he noticed the police lights flashing in his rearview mirror. He did what any law-abiding citizen would do. Signaling properly, he pulled his black sedan to the side of the quiet suburban street, turned off the engine, and placed his hands where they could be seen on the steering wheel. 20 years on the bench had taught him how these situations should go. The approaching footsteps were heavier than necessary, aggressive even. 2 officers appeared, one on each side of his car, their flashlights aimed directly at his face with unnecessary intensity. The judge squinted against the harsh light, but maintained his composure. "License and registration," the officer on the driver's side barked, without any greeting or explanation for the stop. The judge kept his movements slow and deliberate as he reached for his wallet. "Sir, I'm a circuit court judge. My ID is in my wallet." "Did I ask what you do for a living?" The officer cut him off sharply. "Just show me your license." The judge's heart sank. He'd seen this scenario play out countless times in his courtroom, but experiencing it firsthand was different. The disrespect in the officer's tone was palpable, but he kept his voice steady. "Of course, officer." He carefully pulled out his wallet, making sure both his driver's license and judicial ID were visible. The second officer's flashlight beam jumped from his face to his hands, following every movement like he was a suspect in a violent crime rather than a respected member of the judiciary. "Step out of the vehicle," the first officer commanded, hand resting on his holster. The judge's blood ran cold, but he complied, movements still measured and calm. "May I ask why I am being asked to exit my vehicle?" "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area," came the vague reply. The judge knew better. This was his own neighborhood, where he'd lived for the past 12 years. There hadn't been any suspicious activity reports. He would have heard about them. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. As he stepped out, keeping his hands visible, the second officer suddenly grabbed his arm. The judge instinctively stiffened, a natural human response to unexpected contact, and that was all it took. "Stop resisting," the first officer shouted, though the judge wasn't resisting at all. Before he could process what was happening, he was spun around and slammed against his own car. The cold bite of handcuffs dug into his wrists as the officers roughly cuffed him, ignoring his calm attempts to identify himself again. "Please," he said quietly, maintaining his dignity even as his cheek pressed against the cool metal of his car roof. "My judicial ID is right there. This is a mistake." But they weren't listening. Instead, they were roughly patting him down, tossing around terms like suspicious behavior and resisting arrest into their radios. The judge closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of every similar story he'd heard in his courtroom over the years. Now he wasn't just hearing these stories, he was living one. The neighbors were starting to peek out of their windows. Some had their phones out, recording. The judge could feel the heat of shame and anger rising in his chest, but he kept his composure. He taught his children that dignity couldn't be taken away, only given away. So he stood tall, even in handcuffs, knowing that this moment would become something bigger than a simple traffic stop gone wrong. As they led him to the patrol car, he caught his reflection in his car window. There he was, still in his perfectly pressed suit from the fundraiser, his graying hair still neatly combed, his reading glasses hanging from his breast pocket, being treated like a common criminal. The irony wasn't lost on him. In less than 12 hours, he was supposed to be sitting on the bench in the very courthouse where they were about to take him. The patrol car door slammed shut behind him, and as they drove away, the judge watched his car and his dignity fade into the distance. But even then, a small part of him knew that this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of something much bigger than himself.